Well, good morning. Nice that you can join us for this second day of our Westminster Annual Conference. I've been asked to speak about the topic of the church as neighbor. And maybe when you hear that word neighbor in a theological or biblical context, you think immediately of that famous story in Luke 10, when a teacher of the law asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" Now, I'd like to suggest that that was actually a really good question. Now, there's a sense in which it wasn't a good question for that teacher of the law because Luke tells us that he asked with bad intentions. He was trying to trap Jesus. However, if you just think about that question in the abstract, who is my neighbor, is actually a really good question. Why is that? Well, if we are to love our neighbors as ourselves, it's pretty important to know who our neighbors actually are. Who are these people that we're supposed to love as ourselves? Now, if you think about this question, you might think about it first in terms of identity. What's the identity of our neighbors? How can we locate and identify who our neighbors are? And that's a good question because the answer to that question changed somewhat in different eras of redemptive history. The answer for that question for Israel of old isn't exactly the same as it is for the church today. But now if we keep thinking about that question, who is my neighbor? Or how do we think about the idea of neighbor? We might probe a little bit more deeply, and then we would ask the question of what kind of neighbors are our neighbors? Because just because we identify someone as a neighbor doesn't necessarily mean that that neighbor is the same kind of neighbor as another neighbor is. What am I talking about here? Well, when we refer to someone as a neighbor, we might think of fellow believers, fellow Christians, people with whom we share intimate bonds of fellowship, spiritual fellowship. However, if our neighbors are non-Christians, people with whom we don't share an immediate religious, spiritual bond, how are we to think about them? What kind of neighbors are they? How are we to love them? Now, these non-Christian neighbors might have very different ideas from ourselves as to what being a good neighbor is. Some of these people may not want to be our neighbors at all. So how should the church be a neighbor to them? Well, I would like to suggest that the way that the Church of Jesus Christ, here under the New Covenant, the way that we answer these questions is unique in redemptive history. In other words, how we approach these things is different from how our spiritual ancestors under the Old Testament were to answer these questions. And I'd also suggest that the way we are to think about our neighbors and be neighbors to others is actually more challenging, more delicate for us today than it was for our spiritual ancestors of old. I would also suggest that we have a better task set before us than did our spiritual ancestors, but it's also a more difficult one. So let's think about these things together, and I would like to begin by going back to the Old Testament and thinking about the situation, you might say, the obligations of being a neighbor, first for Abraham and his household, and then for Israel living under Moses in their promised land, to think about that, and then to turn and to think about the distinctiveness, even the uniqueness of our situation as New Covenant Christians. So first, let's go back and to think about Abraham and his neighbors. So how do we think about Abraham? How do we think about his situation? Well, we know that Abraham had a lot of different neighbors, don't we? If you think back to the stories in Genesis about Abraham and his family, Genesis tells us that they were sojourners. And as sojourners, it means that they wandered around. It means that they moved from place to place on a regular basis. So that means that Abraham had a lot of different neighbors, and you might say a lot of changing neighbors. Now, these neighbors were strangers to the covenant that God had made with him. You remember we learn about this in Genesis 15 and 17, that God had entered into covenant with Abraham and his house and his household. And Abraham's household moved around, and they confronted a lot of different people, and yet these other people, they were not covenant members. They were not members of his household. And so presumably then, they did not share the same faith that Abraham had. They did not share the same religious convictions. They didn't have the natural bonds of spiritual fellowship. Now, we don't usually think of members of our own house, of our own households, as neighbors per se. And so if we think of Abraham's household as that covenant community, all of their neighbors were strangers to the covenant that God had made with them. They were spiritual strangers, we might say. So how was Abraham to treat them? How was Abraham's household to live in relation to those many neighbors that they had in their wanderings, in their sojournings? I think what we can say as a general matter is that Abraham and his household were to live in peaceful coexistence with these neighbors. This is the kind of neighbors they were, the kind of neighbors with which we try to get along as best we can. Perhaps you might say that they were common grace neighbors. If you are familiar with the terminology that we use in our theology sometimes, God's common grace preserves this world. It comes to all people in distinction from God's special saving grace that comes to his church. We might think of Abraham, his neighbors were common grace neighbors, neighbors that God was preserving, God was sustaining through his common grace. And Abraham was called to live in peaceful coexistence with them. And as we read those stories in Genesis, I think we can say that Abraham generally seems to have done this. Of course, we know Abraham sojourned for decades, and we have relatively little information about what happened during the vast majority of that time. But from the stories that we have, we can say that Abraham generally tried to mind his own business. They generally tried to stay by themselves, to work amongst themselves. But sometimes we know that Abraham and his household had to interact with his neighbors, with their neighbors. We have stories in which they did property transactions, stories in which they entered into treaties with each other, stories in which there were legal disputes and they came into a courtroom setting with each other. And generally speaking, it seems that Abraham tried to get along with them. Abraham tried to live at peace with them. Now, of course, if you're familiar with those stories, you know that there were some times when Abraham, he didn't do such a good job of living peacefully and we might say justly alongside his neighbors. We have a couple of stories in which Abraham goes into a place and he tells his wife to say that she was his sister. And it ended up that the local magistrates took his wife into their homes. And those local magistrates weren't very happy when they figured out what was going on. And they actually rebuked Abraham. These were times when Abraham was not being a good neighbor. He was not living in peaceful, just coexistence with them. And they actually took him to task for that. And so, well, that gives us a little general summary, I think, of what Abraham's interaction with his neighbors was. But I think it's important now to point out that there's another way that Abraham might have interacted with his neighbors, but didn't. Abraham did not deal with his neighbors as potential fellow believers. You might say Abraham did not treat his neighbors as objects of evangelism or of mission work, you might say. So I would like you to look at this as a second way in which people might look at others as neighbors. I might look at non-believers as neighbors. You might look at them as people to live with in peaceful coexistence, or you might look at them as objects of evangelism, as people for whom we would like to share the good news and to bring them into spiritual fellowship with us. Now, Abraham didn't do that. We have no stories, no evidence that Abraham treated his neighbors in this way. Was that wrong for Abraham to fail to do that? Well, I don't think so. I mean, for one thing, God gave Abraham no evangelistic commission. There's nothing like the Great Commission that we find at the end of Matthew's Gospel given to Abraham in Genesis. God never told Abraham to proclaim the good news, to proclaim the faith to those around him. And while it's also true that God didn't prohibit Abraham from doing that, as far as we know, it's not exactly even clear what Abraham would have said to his neighbors if he had wanted to do something like this. I mean, think about this for a moment. God had made covenant promises to Abraham and his offspring, to Abraham's house. What exactly would have been the good news that Abraham could have brought to his neighbors? God had not entered covenant with them. God had not offered the covenant to them. God had said, he had said that Abraham's descendants would be a blessing to many nations, but that was a distant promise. That was a far-off promise in a mysterious future. So it's not exactly clear what message of good news or what kind of evangelistic work Abraham actually could have exercised towards his non-believing neighbors. And so I would like to suggest that in many respects, Abraham's responsibilities were simple. Abraham had to live at peace with his neighbors as far as possible. Now, it's not, as we know from the stories, it wasn't always simple to know exactly how to do this best, but it was uncomplicated. Try to live at peace with them as far as possible, and, this is important too, and if things get uncomfortable, if things start getting rocky in those relationships, then just move on if you want. It was no problem for Abraham to pick up his tents, move his flocks, and go to some other place where it would be easier to live in peace. So that was Abraham's story. Well, what about Israel? If we move along in biblical history to the story of Israel living under the law of Moses in their promised land, how were they to think about neighbors? Well, here things get more complicated than the situation with Abraham. And let me try to describe a little bit how Israel was to think about the idea of neighbors. Now, if there's one text that we would think about first, that we would focus our attention on, it would surely be Leviticus 19, verse 18. This is one of the best-known verses from the Old Testament. It's quoted many times in the New Testament. The most famous part of this verse, the one that's well known to most Christians, is that we should love our neighbor as ourselves. We've heard that so many times. So love your neighbor as yourself. That was told to Israel long ago. But there's more to the verse than just that. You might say this is a lesser-known part of the verse. It doesn't usually that doesn't get quoted. And the lesser-known part of the verse identifies who the neighbor is. It actually tells us the people who are the neighbors to be loved. Leviticus 19:18 says these are the sons of your own people. The sons of your own people. In other words, Israelites were to love their fellow Israelites as neighbors. They were to love their fellow covenant members as their neighbors. And the law of Moses as a whole provided rather detailed instructions for how to do that. There are all sorts of ways that Israel was to love their fellow Israelites. But that raises a lot of questions then. What about other people? Because it wasn't as if Israelites only interacted with other Israelites. Who were some of the other people that they would have confronted? Well, one group of people were those Gentile nations, those pagan Gentile nations that had lived in their land before them, and many of whom continue to live in that land, in that promised land of Canaan, alongside them. Now, how were they to treat them? Well, we know in the Mosaic law that God did not tell Israel to love those foreign nations. In fact, not only did it not tell them to love them, but it told them to get them out of their land. They did not belong in that land. They were to be expunged from that land, expelled from that land. They were not supposed to be there at all. In terms of Leviticus 19, verse 18, I think we can say quite confidently that those Gentile nations who were living in the land, trying to live in that promised land, did not count as neighbors under Leviticus 19, verse 18. Now, I know that raises, this is an issue that's raised a lot of difficult moral and theological questions through the years, and I don't want to get into those questions much right now. But I think we can say at least this, without trying to get into all of the difficult questions that flow from that. God prohibited Israel from loving these people as neighbors either through peaceful coexistence or evangelistically. They were not to live in peaceful coexistence with them, and God never called them to evangelize them, to look at them as objects of mission work. So those are one group of people that Israel would have confronted. Now, another group of people that Israel would have confronted were those Gentile nations outside of their land. All right, so what I was just talking about were Gentile nations within their land. What about those outside of their land? Now, generally, it seems that God wished them to live in peaceful coexistence with them. They didn't have any kind of calling from God to go and to take over other nations, to go lord it over other countries. No, it seems that they were to live peacefully with them, coexist with them as fellow nations of the world. Now, occasionally, if we read the Old Testament story, we read that Israel could actually have rather cordial, friendly relations with these other nations. And I'm thinking of stories like that with Hiram, king of Tyre, with whom Solomon had very friendly relations. Or the Queen of Sheba. Here is a ruler of another country with whom, again, Solomon had friendly relations. So peaceful coexistence with those foreign nations. And yet, here again, don't we have to say that Israel had no evangelistic mandate toward these foreign nations? Never do we read in the Mosaic Law or elsewhere in the Old Testament that Israel had some sort of a great commission to go and bring the good news to these other countries, to these other peoples. And again, if you think about this, it's hard to know what Israel really would have said to them, even if they wanted to do something like this on their own initiative. I mean, once again, God had made the covenant and made the covenant promises to Israel, to that nation, to that people. What exactly were they to say to other nations? What other good news was there for them at that time? Now we know, of course, in the Old Testament that many of the prophets spoke of a coming day, a day in the future, when God would call in many nations, and many nations would join Israel in bringing worship to the Lord. Many nations would experience the grace of God, but that was in the future. We know that the story of Jonah, of course. Jonah is really an outlier kind of story. Here is one prophet who actually went to a foreign nation and preached to them and called them to turn away from their sins. And yet, one of the things that strikes us about the story of Jonah is how exceptional it is, how unusual that is. So unusual that it was immensely disorienting for Jonah himself. Here was the prophet of the Lord who didn't want to do it, who didn't quite know what to do and didn't know how to respond to this call and to the reaction to his preaching. And so if we think about Israel in its relation to those nations outside of its land, okay, they were to live, in a sense, like Abraham, as good neighbors with them, but with no evangelistic commission. Now, that basically brings me to the conclusion of my comments about Israel under Moses, but I do want to just mention a couple of qualifications to what I just said, just so you don't think I'm ignoring some things that are also in the Old Testament. We do know that Israelites were to extend neighbor love to sojourners within their land. Not to those foreign nations themselves who were trying to keep a foothold within the land, but there were Gentile sojourners in their land, and Israel was to love them. They were to treat them fairly, to treat them justly, and yet at the same time, there is no clear evangelistic mission to them either that we can see in the Old Testament. The other thing I wanted to say is that it is true, of course, that Gentiles could be welcomed into the covenant people, and we see a handful of examples of that in the Old Testament. We read stories about Rahab and Ruth, for example, who were incorporated into God's people, Israel. So it was possible, and yet it wasn't as though Israel was commissioned to make such people his disciples, as if they were commissioned to incorporate them into Israel. It was possible, but it was not commanded. So those are my thoughts on the Old Testament situation, the different kind of situation that Abraham and Israel under Moses found themselves in. So now I want to turn to our situation as New Covenant Christians. And obviously this is our main focus. This is where our real interest lies. How can the church be neighbor? How should we be neighbor to others? Well, just to cut right to the chase, one of the most important things that we can say about this is that under the New Covenant, Christians are to regard all people as neighbors. We obviously are to regard our fellow believers as neighbors, and so the church is an assembly of neighbors, of people who come from different places, from different households, from different backgrounds, and are joined together as a community of neighbors. But it's not just fellow believers that are our neighbors. We are called in the New Testament to treat all people as our neighbors, whether they believe the Christian message or not. Now, when I speak for the rest of my lectures, I speak about the church as neighbor, as we try to think about the implications of what I've just said. Let me be clear that I want to focus upon how the church treats unbelievers as neighbors. I think that is the main point of what I ought to be doing in this lecture. So I'm not going to be speaking about how we treat fellow believers as neighbors. That's important, obviously. But I want to focus upon how we view our non-Christian neighbors as neighbors. And here I think there are two crucial things to say about the church as a neighbor today. All right, so here are two crucial things, and then we'll try to think about some of the implications of that. First, and this is to pick up an idea or terminology that I was using earlier. First, we're to live in peaceful coexistence with our unbelieving neighbors as far as possible. We're to live as far as possible in peaceful coexistence with our non-Christian neighbors. And there's a text in the New Testament that says that absolutely explicitly. And I'm thinking of Romans 12, verse 18. Romans 12 through 15 is one of the longest and greatest summaries of the character of the Christian life, what our Christian moral life ought to look like. And in the midst of that discussion, Romans 12, verse 18 tells us, as far as it lies with you, live in peace with all people. And so that is a central obligation of our Christian life. Secondly, here's the second thing that I would like to say. We are to regard our non-Christian neighbors as potential fellow Christians, not just as those with whom we live in peaceful coexistence, but as potentially fellow believers. Therefore, we think of them as the objects of our evangelism, the objects of our mission work, those to whom the gospel can be and ought to be brought, those to whom we hold out the invitation to believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and to be baptized and become part of his church. So, if you think about those two things, with respect to the first thing, peaceful coexistence, in that respect, we are to be like Abraham. We have a task like Abraham in living peacefully alongside a variety of neighbors. And yet, pretty different from Israel under Moses, at least with respect to those Gentile nations who living beside them. But with respect to the second thing I've just mentioned, looking at all of our non-Christian neighbors as potential fellow believers, that's very different from the Old Testament situation, both under Abraham and under Moses. And I would like to suggest then that this makes things a lot more difficult and complicated and delicate for us as New Covenant Christians. It was simpler under the Old Testament. Just think about this. Maybe the incongruity has actually struck you already, but I just want to make it clear. Think about those two things that I just said. On the one hand, God calls us to live peacefully with all people. And at the same time, he wants us to hold out a message to them that is inherently offensive. Because the gospel is inherently offensive. The gospel message says, you are a sinner. Your life is not the way it ought to be. The threat of God's judgment lies upon you. And yet there's a way out. There's good news of salvation in Jesus Christ. But you see, it's an inherently offensive message because people don't want to be told that they're sinners. People don't want to be told that perhaps they have a problem with God or God has a problem with them. And so we are called to live peacefully with people and simultaneously to tell them something very offensive. And we don't ordinarily think of living peacefully and telling people offensive things as being compatible. And so this calls for reflection. And on the one hand, we can't try to get out of this tension, out of this difficulty by simply ignoring one of those two things that I was just talking about. It's tempting. I think it's very tempting for Christians simply to focus on one of those two obligations and forget about the other. Perhaps to focus so much on living at peace with other people that the church forgets to hold out its offensive message of the gospel. On the other hand, perhaps it's tempting for others to be rightfully zealous, to hold out the gospel for others, and just simply forget about the fact that we are to be peaceful neighbors who try to get along with people as far as possible, who don't like living at something other than peacefully with our neighbors. And let me also say this. we can't try to minimize this tension by simply picking up and moving away. What I mean is, if we find that it's difficult to live peacefully and hold out an offensive message in a certain place, we can't just adopt the simple solution just to move away to somewhere where we won't have that kind of tension. We don't have the option of simply, let's form our own neighborhood, our own community, our own country, our own ghetto. And so we don't have to deal with other people. Well, that's not an acceptable thing either. Abraham could do that. Abraham could just pick up and move. That was fine. But we as the Church of Jesus Christ can't just do that. You see, Christ wants his church everywhere. He wants his church in every nation. He wants his church in every society, in every community. You might think of Paul's discussion in 1 Corinthians 5. In the bigger picture in 1 Corinthians 5, he speaks of how the church needs to do discipline when there is sin and rebellion within the church. But he says he doesn't mean that you shouldn't associate with wicked people in general, that you shouldn't associate with non-Christians. He's saying otherwise you'd have to leave the world. And what Paul implies is, I don't want you to leave the world. The Lord wants us to be in the world. He wants us to be associating with non-Christians. He wants us to have non-Christian neighbors. So we can't just try to get rid of the tension. We have to live with the tension of peaceful coexistence and holding out an inherently offensive message. So what I would like to do in the last part of my lecture is to offer some reflections on how we conduct ourselves as we try to navigate this tension, a tension that we have to embrace rather than simply try to avoid. Now, I'm not going to focus really on personal individual strategies. I mean, I think what I say does have personal individual implications, but I'm not trying to offer you tips on how to deal with the person who lives next door, the non-Christian who lives next door. That's not my purpose. I want to think about the church as a whole. How does the church as a whole think about its place in this world, how it is a good neighbor, both in terms of peaceful coexistence and in holding out the offensive gospel message? So I have three general thoughts, and that's how I'm going to that's where I'm going to focus for the remainder of my lecture, on these three main thoughts, although I think you'll see that they are interconnected. So here is the first. This is, again, the first of how the church is to navigate this tension. So the first thought is this: the only offense that we give is the gospel itself. We should strive as far as we can to give no offense to our non-Christian neighbors, except the gospel message itself, the gospel of salvation through the work of the Lord Jesus Christ. If we have to hold out an offense, if we have to be offensive, which in a way we have to be if we are going to be proclaimers of the gospel, if we have to hold out an offensive message, let's be sure that our neighbors don't miss that message because they're so focused on other ways that we're offending them. How easy it is for us to offend people in all sorts of other ways, and that the offense of the gospel gets missed in the process. Now, I'd like to take your minds back for a moment to the lecture from Dr. Johnson last night. Now, I'm sure that there are some of you listening who didn't hear Dr. Johnson's lecture last night, but I will assume that most of you did. And Dr. Johnson spoke primarily from 1 Peter, and one of the things that he focused on is how we should not conform to the behavior of this world, and how the people of this world will think it strange if we don't join them in all sorts of wicked behavior. Now, all of that is true. I have no disagreement with anything Dr. Johnson said about that. But I'm going to do something a little bit awkward and say, I want to also suggest just the opposite. All right, so just hear me out here. I think Dr. Johnson would agree with all the things that I'm about to say right now, too. There is also a place, in addition to those things that Dr. Johnson was talking about, there is also a place for righteous conformity to the world around us. There is a place for non-offensively blending in, not embracing sinful practices, corrupt, debaucherous behavior. That's the thing that Dr. Johnson was talking about, right? But on other things, things that are indifferent, things that can go either way. Righteous conformity, not being non-offensive and blending in. This is actually an important point in the epistle to Diognetus, which is something that Dr. Johnson, I think, very helpfully mentioned in his lecture. Even though the epistle to Diognetus talks about how Christians are not to join non-Christians in debaucherous behavior, at the same time, the epistle to Diognetus talks about how Christians will wear the same clothes, we'll speak the same language, we'll eat the same food, we'll share all sorts of customs. That's fine. Now, one way to look at this, I'm going to borrow something that I heard someone else use some years back. For many years now, I've been part of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church Timothy Conference, and this is a conference for young men who have potential for the ministry, and we have a conference every year for them. And some years back, we had a lecturer, a local pastor, local to where we were meeting that year. And as he was giving a lecture to these young men, late high school, early college age, he said these memorable words to them. He looked them in the eye and he said, "Don't be weird." And that's a pretty powerful message. It's a pretty important message. Sometimes Christians can be weird. Sometimes people in our churches can be kind of oddballs. I'm just looking at a camera right now. I have no one of you in mind at the moment. But let's face it, we can be a little weird sometimes. And sometimes the world can look at us, non-Christians can look at us, and what they see is not the gospel, but they see our weirdness. They see our oddness. You think about this. The gospel, when people look at the church, it should be the gospel that stands out. It shouldn't be our oddness. It shouldn't be our weirdness that stands out. It's okay to conform in a lot of ways. It's okay not to be weird in all sorts of ways. Let us make sure as the church that it is the gospel that is offensive. It is the gospel that's weird and not us. But of course, there are worse things than simply being weird. The church can offend by being loud, by being obnoxious. The church can offend by hypocritically winking at its own sins, its own failings. Sometimes it's terrible failings, while wanting to hold all sorts of other people accountable for their failings and being very quick to judge others for their failings. And if we don't think that the world sees our hypocrisy, if we don't think the world sees our own sins, that perhaps we're all too willing to justify and to explain away, we're deceiving ourselves. Perhaps for this first point, I could just leave you with Paul's words in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians 9 is where Paul makes his famous statement that he seeks to be all things to all people. And of course, Paul had his own context here. He was thinking specifically about about ministering to Jews and ministering to Gentiles. But the things that he says, it's clear that Paul is speaking in general. He's not just speaking to a very particular situation, but to more general principles that all Christians, that the church of all time needs to follow. Paul says that he sought to make himself a servant to all. Why? It was all, he said, for the sake of the gospel. To Jews, he became a Jew. To Gentiles, he became a Gentile. To the weak, he became weak. To the strong, he became strong. That's a kind of a righteous conformity. It's a kind of a righteous blending in. You see, Paul was seeking to be a good neighbor in both of the senses that I suggested. Living in peaceful coexistence, not unnecessarily offending, and yet at the same time doing it all for the sake of the gospel, so that nothing would get in the way of the gospel proclamation. Let the gospel stand out rather than ourselves. That's clearly what the Apostle Paul sought to do. Well, that brings me to the second of these three things that I would like to mention. And that is this, is that the church should not be power-hungry, but humble. I think this is a very important way that we navigate this tension that I have been describing. The church should not be power-hungry, but humble. Now you just think about, in ordinary life, good neighbors. What does it mean to be a good neighbor to the people next door, the people across the street? Well, good neighbors don't try to lord it over each other. Is your neighbor going to think you're a good neighbor if you're constantly giving advice, if you're constantly telling him or her what they ought to do? Hey, you know what? You ought to paint your front door red. Hey, you know, you ought to get rid of that tree and plant this other tree. Oh, and by the way, I think you should raise your children differently. They're watching too much television. Well, you're not going to be considered a good neighbor if you're constantly trying to lord it over your neighbors' lives. Well, that's something worth thinking about for the church. Does the church try to lord it over others, try to lord it over others in its community? Well, I think the church, certainly the church in America, has a real temptation to do that, and I suggest often a problem with doing that. How often the church acts, at least here in the United States, how often the church acts as though Christians ought to be in charge. Either that we are in charge, we're going to pretend like we're in charge, or we're going to act as though we ought to be in charge. We talk as though the United States has to be a Christian country. We speak about how we need to get our people, get good people into positions of cultural influence, into centers of power, right? Presumably because we want power, presumably because we want influence. Well, let me say, of course, there's nothing wrong at all with promoting what is just. There's nothing wrong at all with voting for those whom we think will be the best office holders or the best candidates for a particular office. Nothing wrong with that. In fact, those are good things. And yet, we need to think about our rhetoric, and we need to think about the way that we pursue these things. I mean, we Christians have no more right than anyone else, do we? To claim that we're in charge, to claim that this is our country, to claim that we should have special privileges. I mean, a lot of Christians like to appeal to the United States Constitution. Well, the Constitution itself doesn't give Christians any special place, doesn't give us any special privilege, doesn't tell us that this is a Christian country and that we need to act as though it is or to reclaim it as such. The very Constitution that many of us admire says there should be no established church, grants all people freedom of religious practice. I think this is true theologically. It's not just a constitutional matter, but theologically. The New Testament never indicates to us that we are going to be in charge of our countries, never tells us how to run a nation. It never tells us to look at ourselves as though we are the power brokers. In fact, you think about the broader theme of this conference, it tells us that we're exiles, we're sojourners. In fact, that points us in just the opposite direction. When we speak in the ways that I'm kind of warning about, we make ourselves, or we make the church becomes just another power-seeking faction. Well, we sort of expect political parties to seek power. We expect Republicans and Democrats to seek power. We might expect other sorts of political groups to try to seek power. But do we want the church to be another power brokering institution? Doesn't that bring disrepute upon Christianity? That's not being a good neighbor, is it, if we are seeking power? Well, sometimes we might try to mask this, put a good veneer on this by saying, well, we're not acting in the name of Christianity, we're acting in the name of righteousness. We're trying to promote what's righteous in our communities. Well, that's not, sure, yes, let's promote what's good and right and just in our communities. But you see, this can be subtly dangerous as well, because it can so easily involve thinking as though, well, we are the righteous people, and other people aren't. Christians are the righteous people, non-Christians aren't. Is that really true? Is it really so simple? Well, one of the things about good neighbors is that they're humble. Good neighbors live with their neighbors in humility. Good neighbors recognize that they don't always have all the answers. They recognize that their neighbors sometimes know things they don't, that their neighbors sometimes see things that they don't, that they have insights that they don't, that these neighbors, we can learn something from our neighbors. Isn't this what we're called to do as Christians? Isn't this what the church is to do as a good neighbor? Don't we learn from others? Aren't we humble before others? You might think about how often the book of Proverbs tells us to listen to advice, to seek counsel, to heed correction. I can't say this with certainty, but it may well be that there is no theme that appears more often in Proverbs than this. The wise person is willing to take correction, wants to learn from others, learns lessons from others. There's a lot of temptation in our world, particularly in our politically charged world, to discredit others and justify ourselves for the reason that we don't want others to gain credibility and to gain power. We see this, surely we see this in our political world today, in which there's so much pressure from people in each of our main political parties not to acknowledge anything good about people in the other party. Why? Well, because any credibility you give to the other party might give them an advantage over you. And since our goal, it seems, is to gain as much power for ourselves, anything we can do to discredit the other, that seems to be good. Anything to justify ourselves is good. But brothers and sisters, if the church is not playing power politics, we don't have to live like that. And we shouldn't live like that. We can hear others out. We can read their books. We can have conversations with them in which we want to gain insight from them as well, and perhaps even more than we feel like we need to give insight to them. Surely we have a lot to learn from our non-Christian neighbors. They can expose things in us that we perhaps haven't noticed in ourselves. That's part of being a good neighbor. Well, I have one final point, and I need to make it very, very briefly. And I think I can. Let me just leave you with this. This is the third way that we might navigate this tension. We should endure all things and turn the other cheek. Just back to Proverbs for a moment. Proverbs has a lot to say about living peacefully as good neighbors, about how do we live peacefully with other people, even when there's tension in the air. And one way Proverbs communicates this is that we should not be easily offended. We're not easily offended. Proverbs 12:16. The vexation of a fool is known at once, but the prudent ignores an insult. Proverbs 19:11, good sense makes one slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook an offense. We're not to be easily offended. And then, of course, we think about the New Testament where that gets even deepened. Think about Matthew 5:38 through 42, where the Lord tells us that we should turn the other cheek. We don't slap back when someone slaps one cheek, but we turn the other cheek. We're willing to take an insult, willing to take a second insult rather than to give an insult in return. Or you might think of 1 Corinthians 13, verse 7. Love, 1 Corinthians 13, of course, the great love chapter. 1 Corinthians 13, 7. Love bears all things. It endures all things. And I simply leave you with this. How will the gospel of forgiveness in Christ, how will it be plausible to our non-Christian neighbors if we don't have a spirit of forgiveness towards others? If we are easily insulted, if we are easily offended, if we are quick to try to retaliate, how will the gospel of forgiveness in Christ, how will that possibly be plausible to our non-Christian neighbors? Well, thank you for being here and for hearing this lecture, and I look forward to our question and answer time later.